Welcome to Revenge with Roman, where betrayal, hidden truths, and vengeance intertwine into unforgettable tales. Each story we share is crafted with raw emotion, sharp suspense, and a kind of shocking twist that will leave you speechless until the very end. High voltage in today's story. My hidden life unraveled the moment I try to help. What was meant to be a simple act of kindness quickly turned into the unraveling of a deeply guarded secret. One choice, one moment of stepping forward to help, became the very spark that exposed a life carefully built on silence and shadows. What followed was a storm of betrayal, heartbreak, and a revenge so cold it changed everything forever. Ethan Cross had always been the kind of man who seemed ordinary to anyone who passed him on the street. He worked at a modest job, kept a quiet apartment, and rarely let himself get involved in the chatter of neighbors or the noisy drama of the city around him. To the casual eye, he was just another face in the crowd. Polite enough to nod when spoken to, cautious enough never to share too much, and disciplined in a way that made him seem detached. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior was a man carrying an entire world of secrets, a hidden life that could never be spoken of, not even to those who claimed to be closest to him. He had built this life with precision, like an architect designing walls strong enough to keep everything out. Every decision Ethan made, where he lived, who he spoke to, the jobs he chose, even the very words he allowed himself to say, was calculated to protect the truth he carried. It wasn't just about survival. It was about control. For years, he had worked tirelessly to bury what had once defined him, sealing away the scars, the mistakes, and the dangerous ties that could destroy him if ever brought into the light again. To his co-workers, he was a quiet man who showed up on time and left without fuss. To his landlord, he was a reliable tenant who never caused trouble. To the world, he was invisible, and that was exactly how Ethan preferred it. Yet invisibility came at a price. Nights were the hardest, when the city's noise quieted and his mind refused to follow. In those moments, the memories he tried to suffocate clawed their way to the surface. Faces he wanted to forget haunted him, voices he once trusted echoed with betrayal, and decisions he had made replayed like an old film he couldn't escape. He would sit by his window, staring at the streetlights flickering against the asphalt, and wonder the life he now lived was truly freedom or just another kind of prison. His chest carried a weight no one could see, and he had trained himself to smile when necessary, to look normal, even when the emptiness gnawed at him from within. There were times when people tried to get closer, friendly neighbors offering dinner, coworkers asking him to join for drinks, strangers trying to strike up conversations. Ethan always found a way to gently decline, never rude, but never allowing anyone past the walls he had built. It wasn't that he hated people. It was that he knew what happened when you let someone in. Secrets had a way of leaking through cracks, and once they did, there was no undoing it. The past had taught him that trust was dangerous, that the more someone knew about you, the easier it became for them to use it against you. And Ethan had no intention of being vulnerable ever again. But despite his distance, there was a quiet strength in him that people often sense without understanding why. He moved with the kind of discipline that only came from years of training. His eyes, sharp and observant, noticed things others overlooked. Even when he stayed silent, his presence carried a weight, as though he was always aware of more than he revealed. These were the remnants of the life he had left behind, habits too deeply ingrained to erase. They made him appear watchful, almost protective, though no one ever dared to ask why. Ethan sometimes wondered if this double life could last forever. There were moments when the world around him seemed on the verge of colliding with the one he had buried. A news headline that mentioned a name from his past, a stranger's glance that lingered too long, a sudden sound that pulled him back into memories of darker days. It all reminded him that no matter how carefully he lived, danger was never far. He had learned to live in constant readiness, even while pretending to be a man who had nothing to hide. Still, there was a flicker of longing inside him, a part of him that wished for something normal, something real. Sometimes he imagined what it might be like to live without lies, to share a meal without feeling the need to weigh every word, to let someone look at him and see the whole truth instead of fragments he carefully offered. But those thoughts never lingered for long. Ethan knew better than to indulge in fantasies that had no place in his reality. Safety meant silence. Survival meant secrets. And secrets were the only thing keeping him alive. Ethan Cross was a man divided. One part existing in the world everyone saw, and another forever trapped in the shadows of what had been. He had chosen this path long ago, convincing himself that disappearing into an ordinary life was better than being destroyed by the truth. But even as he lived each day in calculated calm, he never realized how fragile his carefully constructed life truly was. Because it would only take one unexpected moment, one act he never planned for, to tear down the walls he had spent years building. And when that moment came, everything he thought he had escaped would come rushing back with a force he could no longer control. The day started like any other for Ethan Cross, quiet and unremarkable. He followed his usual routine with precision, waking before dawn, running through his carefully chosen path where no one ever stopped to chat, and returned to his apartment just as the city began to stir awake. To anyone watching, he looked like a man of discipline, perhaps a little solitary, but harmless in every way. Ethan had mastered the art of blending in, never drawing attention to himself. He preferred it that way. But life is a cruel way of testing even the most carefully built routines. And on this particular day, that test arrived without warning. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, when Ethan decided to stop at a small cafe tucked into the corner of a busy street. He didn't often linger in public places, but the cafe had become a quiet refuge for him. Somewhere he could sit in the corner and disappear into the background. The aroma of coffee, the hum of conversation, the clinking of cups. It was ordinary enough to keep him hidden in plain sight. That was the safety of ordinary. But safety shattered in an instant when the door burst open and chaos rushed in with it. A woman staggered inside, her face pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with panic. She clutched her chest as though the air itself had betrayed her. People gasped, chairs scraped against the floor, but no one moved. The cafe froze, customers staring with wide eyes, unsure what to do. Ethan's heart clenched. He had trained himself to stay invisible, to never draw attention, but the instincts buried deep inside him screamed louder than his fear of exposure. He knew the signs, the way her hands trembled, the uneven rhythm of her breaths. It was a medical crisis unfolding right before his eyes. And no one else was moving fast enough. Without thinking, Ethan was on his feet. The old habits, the skills he worked so hard to bury, came rushing back like a reflex he could never kill. He pushed past the stunned onlookers, steadying the woman before she could collapse to the floor. His voice was calm but firm as he called for someone to dial emergency services. Kneeling beside her, he checked her pulse, her breathing, guiding her with measured words. His hands moved with precision, each action deliberate, practice, as though he had done this countless times before. And he had, long ago, in the life he no longer spoke of, Ethan had been trained for moments exactly like this. The room seemed to hold its breath as he worked. The woman's breathing began to steady under his guidance, the wild panic in her eyes softening into something fragile but calmer. Around him, strangers whispered, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but with awe. To them, Ethan had transformed from a quiet customer into something entirely different. Someone capable, someone powerful, someone who knew far too much for an ordinary man. And that was the first crack in the wall he had built. He tried to remain detached, tried to silence the voice in his mind that warned him of the danger in revealing too much. But when a life hung in the balance, the part of him that was human, the part of him that refused to watch someone suffer, won out. He couldn't sit still and do nothing. He never could. So he stayed by her side until the paramedics arrived, guiding her through every breath, speaking in a low, steady tone that carried the kind of authority people didn't question. When the professionals finally entered, they exchanged quick glances with him, small, almost imperceptible looks of acknowledgement. They could tell he wasn't just another bystander. He had training, knowledge, something beyond the ordinary. The woman was carried out, her life no longer hanging by a thread, and the cafe erupted in chatter. Strangers came up to thank him, voices overlapping, eyes filled with curiosity and admiration. Ethan forced a tight smile, nodding politely, deflecting their questions as best he could. But he could feel it, the weight of their attention pressing down on him, their eyes lingering too long, their whispers carrying his name. For a man who had spent years perfecting invisibility, this was the worst kind of spotlight. As he stepped out of the cafe, the cool air hit him, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside. He had acted on instinct, unable to stop himself, but in doing so, he had revealed too much. The way he moved, the authority in his voice, the precision of his actions, all that betrayed a part of his past he had fought so hard to bury. And in a city where whispers traveled faster than truth, Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before those whispers reached ears they were never meant to. Walking down the street, he felt the eyes of strangers burning into his back, their voices chasing after him like echoes he couldn't outrun. He had saved a life, but in the process, he had exposed a piece of himself that was never meant to be seen. The fragile mask he had worn for years had slipped, if only for a moment, and that moment was enough. Because when you spend your life hiding, it only takes a single act of humanity to unravel everything. The next morning, Ethan tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. He followed the same routine he always did. Woke before the sun, ran his usual route, kept his eyes down when passing strangers. Yet, despite the familiar rhythm of his day, a tension hung in the air that he couldn't shake. It was as if the entire city was whispering behind his back, even though no one said a word to his face. He had lived too long in the shadows not to recognize the signs. Something had shifted, and no matter how much he wanted to pretend otherwise, he knew the truth. His act of helping the woman at the cafe had left a trail, and trails always led to discovery. When he walked into the office later that morning, the atmosphere confirmed his suspicions. Usually, Ethan was invisible there, a man who did his work with quiet efficiency, the kind no one remembered in detail. But now, heads turned as he entered, conversations faltered mid-sentence, and curious glances followed him to his desk. He set his bag down, forcing calm into his movements, though his pulse betrayed him. The whisper started soon after, just low enough for him not to catch the exact words, but loud enough for him to feel the weight of them. Finally, one of his co-workers, a young man named Riley, who was usually too wrapped up in himself to notice anyone else, leaned against Ethan's desk with an eager grin. "So, hero," Riley said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Word on the street is you saved some woman's life yesterday. What are you, some kind of ex-doctor or soldier or something?" The question was laced with curiosity, but also suspicion, the kind that could cut deeper than a blade if left unanswered. Ethan forced a small, practiced smile. "I was just in the right place at the right time," he said simply, hoping to deflect the conversation. But Riley wasn't the only one watching. Across the room, eyes studied him with renewed interest, and whispers grew bolder. They had all heard something, though each version of the story seemed larger than the truth. Some said he had performed medical procedures with the precision of a surgeon. Others swore he had given orders like a commander in the middle of battle. Each retelling of the event made him sound less like a man and more like a myth, and myths were dangerous. By lunchtime, the whispers had grown into questions he couldn't ignore. A woman from accounting approached him shyly, thanking him for what he had done. Though she admitted she wasn't there, she had just heard about it. Another man joked about Ethan hiding a military past, and though his tone was light, his eyes searched Ethan's face for confirmation. The more Ethan tried to remain silent, the more people filled in the blanks themselves, constructing stories around him that blurred the line between admiration and suspicion. That night, back in the solitude of his apartment, Ethan sat in the dark with only the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. His hands were clasped tightly, his mind racing through every possibility. He replayed the moment in the cafe over and over, wishing he could have found another way, a quieter way. But he knew that wasn't the truth. His instincts had betrayed him. They had shown the world something it was never meant to see. And now the world was pulling at the threads, unraveling the careful disguise he had worn for years. The exposure was subtle at first, but it was enough. People started looking at him differently in the grocery store. The barista at the cafe gave him free coffee one morning with a knowing smile. Even his landlord, a man who had never once cared about small talk, asked if he was doing okay after all that excitement. Each interaction carried the same underlying tone. They knew something was different about him, and they wanted answers. The breaking point came a few days later when he spotted a familiar face outside his apartment building. At first, Ethan thought it was just another passerby, But then the man lingered too long, his gaze too sharp, his posture too controlled. He wasn't just curious, he was watching. Ethan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It was a look of someone who had been searching, someone who had finally found beginning of a trail they thought was long lost. That single moment confirmed his greatest fear. The whispers hadn't stayed confined to cafe or his office. They had traveled further, reaching ears that had no business knowing his name. His hidden life, the one he had spent years burying, wasn't as buried as he thought, and it had only taken a single act of kindness to bring it all crashing down. The days that followed felt like living under a microscope. Every move Ethan made seemed to invite more stares, more whispers, more suspicion. What once felt like freedom and anonymity had turned into a suffocating spotlight that followed him everywhere. He had worked so hard to build a life where no one looked too closely, where his name was nothing more than an afterthought in the minds of strangers. But now it was different. People remembered him, people talked about him, and people wanted to know more. And Ethan knew better than anyone that curiosity was a dangerous spark. It only took the right person to fan it into a wildfire. It began in subtle ways at first, things most people wouldn't have noticed, but Ethan's trained instincts never miss a detail. The man outside his building, the one he had first brushed off as a coincidence, appeared again, different clothes, different angle, but the same calculating stare. He never approached, never spoke, but his presence was deliberate. Then there was a car parked too long across the street, its windows tinted, its engine running longer than necessary. Normal people didn't loiter in silence, watching buildings without a reason. Ethan had seen it before, long ago, in a past life that refused to stay buried. Surveillance. Observation. Someone had begun to watch him. Inside his workplace, the tension grew sharper. His coworkers still laughed and joked, but the tone had changed. There was an edge of curiosity, almost greed, in their eyes. They would toss questions at him casually, pretending it was nothing more than banter, but Ethan could feel the weight behind each one. "So, where'd you learn all that medical stuff, man?" Riley asked one afternoon, smirking as if he expected a rehearsed answer. "You some kind of paramedic in another life?" Others joined in, suggesting he had military training, or maybe law enforcement. Each theory tossed out like bait, waiting to see which one Ethan would react to. He didn't give them the satisfaction. He answered with half smiles, shrugs, and vague phrases that revealed nothing. But silence, he realized, didn't extinguish suspicion, it fed it. People filled the gaps in his story with their own versions, and those versions spread faster than he could control. The whispers that once lived only in the office began to echo beyond it. He overheard his name spoken by strangers on the street. The barista at the cafe told him, "You're the guy who saved that lady, right? That's brave stuff." Not many people would have known what to do. She meant it as a compliment, but Ethan heard the unspoken question in her voice. "Who are you really?" At night, his apartment no longer felt like the safe refuge it once was. The shadows in the corners seemed longer, the silence heavier. He checked the locks 3 times before sitting down, yet the unease never left him. Sometimes, when the city was quiet, he swore he could hear faint footsteps in the stairwell that never reached his floor. Other times, he caught the reflection of movement in the glass of his window, as though someone had been standing on the street below, staring up. His instincts told him what his mind didn't want to accept. He was being hunted again. Memories clawed their way back, unbidden and relentless. Faces from his past resurfaced, voices filled with threats, promises of consequences if he ever stepped out of line. He remembered the night he had walked away, thinking he had finally outsmarted them all, believing he could build a life that was his own. He had convinced himself the past was dead. But now, with each whisper, each curious glance, each shadow that lingered too long, Ethan realized how fragile that illusion had always been. It wasn't just strangers who noticed. The people closest to him, or as close as anyone ever managed to get, had begun to question him too. His landlord, who once cared only about timely rent payments, now asked harmless but probing questions. "You used to be in the service, didn't you? You've got that look about you." Ethan brushed it off, but inside, panic tightened its grip. Every casual remark, every curious stare, Every hint of recognition was another brick pulled from the wall he had built around himself. And once the wall fell, there would be no rebuilding it. Walking home one evening, he felt again that unmistakable sensation of being followed. It was in the rhythm of footsteps behind him, matching his pace a little too perfectly. He turned sharply down a side street, pretending it was part of his route, then cut across another block, moving faster. The footsteps adjusted. Whoever it was, they weren't just wandering, they were tracking him. His pulse quickened, and though his body begged him to confront the shadow, he forced himself to keep walking, blending into the flow of pedestrians until he finally slipped into the safety of a crowded subway station. But the damage was done. He knew now, without a shred of doubt, that his hidden life had drawn attention he couldn't shake. The whispers were no longer harmless curiosity. They had become dangerous, and Ethan could feel the storm gathering around him. What had started as admiration for a good deed was morphing into suspicion, and suspicion was the one thing he could never afford, because suspicion had a way of leading to truths, and the truths about Ethan Cross were never meant to see daylight. The storm he feared finally broke. For days, Ethan had felt the tension building, the whispers circling closer, the shadows pressing in from all sides. He had sensed it like a change in the air before a downpour, inevitable, unstoppable. And then, one evening it happened. His past didn't just creep back into his life. It slammed into him with the force of a door he thought he had locked forever, now ripped open without warning. It began with a letter, not a message left on his phone, or an email that could come from anyone, but a physical envelope slipped under his apartment door while he was out. Ethan noticed it immediately when he returned. White, ordinary at first glance, but with no address, no stamp, no handwriting on the outside. He stood frozen in the hallway, his keys still in his hand, staring at it as though it were a coiled snake waiting to strike. No one left letters like this. Not unless they knew him. Not unless they knew too much. Inside, the words were short, sharp, and merciless. You didn't think we'd forget, did you? The letters were typed, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Ethan's chest tightened as the realization hit him. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. His past had caught up, and the people he had spent years running from were back in his orbit. He had tried to vanish, to bury every trace of the man he once was. But ghosts had a way of digging themselves out of the ground. The letter didn't come alone. Within days, other signs followed. The same car parked outside his building again and again, its driver pretending to scroll through a phone, but never leaving. Strange calls in the middle of the night, where silence lingered on the other end before the line disconnected. Even the locks on his apartment door bore faint scratches one morning, as if someone had tried and failed to force their way in. Each piece was a puzzle that painted a clear picture. He was being watched, tested, reminded that he could never truly escape. And then came the face, the one he thought he would never see again. It happened on a crowded street as he left the subway, the press of people rushing past him in every direction. For a moment, he thought it was just another trick of his mind, another ghost conjured by his fear. But then the man turned, their eyes locking across the flow of strangers, and the world seemed to stop around them. Marcus Hale. The name hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Years ago, Marcus had been more than an enemy. He had been a shadow at the edge of Ethan's every step, a man who thrived on control, intimidation, and ruthless precision. Marcus had been there when everything in Ethan's life had fallen apart, when the choices he made led him down the path he had spent years trying to erase. And now, here he was again, standing on the same sidewalk, his lips curling into a smile that was more threat than greeting. Ethan turned away instantly, forcing himself into the crowd, his pulse racing as if he were being chased. He didn't have to look back to know Marcus was following. The weight of his stare burned into the back of Ethan's neck, a silent reminder that no matter how far he'd run, Marcus had always known the day would come when their paths would cross again. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He paced the length of his apartment. The letters spread out on the table. Marcus's face burned into his memory. The walls felt too thin, the air too heavy. Every sound outside seemed sharper, more threatening. The creak of pipes, the rumble of cars, footsteps in the hall. He tried to steady his breathing, but it came ragged, uneven. He wasn't just fighting fear anymore. He was fighting the certainty that his carefully crafted world was collapsing. For so long, Ethan had convinced himself he could live quietly, unnoticed, a ghost in plain sight. But Marcus's reappearance shattered that illusion. It wasn't just about whispers anymore. It was about survival. Marcus didn't come back to reminisce or play games. He came back because Ethan still had something he wanted, or perhaps because revenge was a hunger Marcus never let go of. The next day, Ethan spotted him again, this time standing across the street from the cafe, arms folded, eyes locked on him with predatory calm. No approach, no words, just silent intimidation. Marcus didn't need to move closer. His presence alone was enough to send a message. I found you. I'm not leaving. Every instinct in Ethan screamed to run, but running had already failed him once. The longer he stood there, the more he realized the truth. This wasn't going away. The past wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a face, a name, and it was staring directly at him. Ethan had always believed that the one advantage of his carefully hidden life was the trust of the few people who had grown to rely on him. He never gave them details, never let them too close, but his quiet stability had built a kind of unspoken faith. Neighbors saw him as reliable, co-workers as steady, and even a small circle of acquaintances he tolerated thought of him as honest, if a little reserved. But the moment suspicion began to swirl and Marcus Hale's shadow returned, that trust began to fracture like glass under pressure. It started small, almost invisible at first. A friend from work, Jenna, who used to share her lunch breaks with him, suddenly grew distant. She smiled politely, but her laughter no longer came as easily, and her questions became sharper, more pointed. One afternoon, she leaned across the table and asked softly, "Ethan, who are you really? You don't just wake up one day and know how to save a life like that. You don't just move the way you do." Her eyes searched his face, not with admiration this time, but with doubt. Ethan froze, forced a shrug, and gave the same rehearsed answer he always did, that he'd read some things, picked up a bit of training here and there. But her expression told him she didn't buy it. She didn't push further, but the silence that followed was louder than any accusation. At home, it grew worse. His landlord, Mr. Callahan, who had once treated him as a perfect tenant, now eyed him differently. One evening, while Ethan handed over the rent, Callahan hesitated before pocketing the envelope. "You're not in trouble, are you?" he asked, his voice tight with caution. "I don't want any situations in my building." The word stung more than Ethan expected. He had lived here for years without a single issue, blending seamlessly into the walls of the place. But now, even a man who once barely noticed him had begun to view him as a potential threat. The hardest part came with the one person Ethan had let closest to his heart. Clara, a woman who had slipped past his defenses over the years with her warmth and patience. She had never pushed too hard, never asked too many questions, content with the little he offered, but even she was beginning to unravel under the weight of his secrecy. One evening, as they sat across from each other in her apartment, she finally said what had been lingering between them for weeks. "I don't know you, Ethan," she whispered, her eyes glistening with hurt. "I thought I did, but now, after everything, I'm not sure. Everyone's talking. They say you saved that woman like you'd done it before, like you've had training. You never told me anything about your past. I don't even know where you're from. How can I trust someone who won't tell me the truth?" Her words cut deeper than any blade. Ethan opened his mouth, desperate to explain, but no explanation came. What could he say? That once upon a time, he was a man who lived in a world built on violence, betrayal, and survival? That the things he knew weren't from books or curiosity, but from scars he carried both inside and out? He wanted to tell her, wanted to strip away the lies and finally let someone see the truth, but the danger of it paralyzed him. The truth didn't just belong to him. It belonged to those still hunting him, and once it slipped free, Clara would be in their crosshairs too. So he stayed silent. That silence destroyed more than words ever could. Clara pulled back, her trust crumbling with every passing day. The warmth in her touch grew cold, her phone calls shorter, her laughter absent. Ethan could feel her slipping away, but he couldn't stop it without breaking the one rule that had kept him alive. Never let the truth out. And it wasn't only Clara. Others he interacted with daily began to mirror the same doubt. At work, conversations would stop when he entered the room. A neighbor who once asked him for help carrying groceries now crossed the hall without meeting his eyes. Even small things, a cashier hesitating before handing him change, a child pointing at him as if repeating something overheard from their parents, felt like daggers. He had become the subject of suspicion, the man no one truly knew, the man people whispered about when they thought he couldn't hear. All of it compounded into an unbearable weight. For years, Ethan had carried the burden of his secret life alone, but now that burden was bleeding into the lives of those around him. They weren't just questioning who he was, they were questioning whether they could ever trust him again. And in their doubt, Ethan saw reflections of his own greatest fear. That maybe he was nothing more than the ghost of the man he used to be, destined to destroy every connection he tried to build. The betrayal wasn't deliberate, but it was there all the same. The looks of distrust, the whispered conversations, the cold distance. They told him what words never needed to. His cover wasn't just unraveling in the eyes of strangers. It was unraveling in the hearts of people he had allowed to matter. And once trust was broken, it could never be pieced back together. Ethan had lived long enough to know that trust was a fragile thing, but he still hadn't expected the knife to come from so close. He thought the world outside his circle could turn on him. Yes, but those within, the few he allowed near his guarded life, he had clung to them as anchors in a sea of shadows. That illusion crumbled the night he discovered a betrayal, a discovery that left his chest hollow and his pulse burning with something darker than fear. It was late, the kind of night when the city outside had finally dulled to a restless quiet, and Ethan sat in his apartment with the curtains drawn. The letter from Marcus still lay on his table, a silent reminder that the storm was far from over. He had been reviewing every detail of his days, every strange look and question, searching for cracks he might have missed. That was when the sound came, soft at first, then louder, the faint vibration of his phone. Not his main phone, the one he used for work and daily life, but the second one, the one no one should have known existed. His blood turned to ice. Only one other person had ever seen that phone, and it wasn't by accident. Clara. He picked it up with trembling hands, and his worst fears solidified when he saw the screen. A message had been sent from his phone, one he hadn't written. A message addressed to a number he hadn't dialed in years. A number that belonged to Marcus Hale. Ethan stared at the words, bile rising in his throat. He's here. I'm with him. The text was short, but it was enough to betray him completely. Enough to confirm what Marcus must have already suspected, that Ethan was alive, that he hadn't vanished into the wind forever. Enough to shatter years of carefully crafted silence. His hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles burned, fury and disbelief colliding inside him. How? How could Clara have touched something she wasn't supposed to? How could she have gone through his things, found the phone, and, whether by curiosity, carelessness, or intent, sent the very signal Marcus had been waiting for? He couldn't breathe as the weight of it settled on him. Clara's distance these past few weeks, her questions, the hurt in her voice, it all seemed like the natural unraveling of someone realizing they didn't know the man beside them. But now Ethan saw it differently. She hadn't just been doubting him. She had been searching, prying, peeling back layers he had begged her not to touch. And in her desperation for truth, she had exposed him to the one man he could never afford to be exposed to. The betrayal twisted inside him. Rage came first, hot and consuming, a fire that made his vision blur. He had warned himself not to let anyone in, not to let his guard slip. He had told himself time and again that the moment you gave someone your trust, you gave him the power to destroy you. And now here he was, standing in the wreckage of exactly that mistake. He had given Clara pieces of himself. Never the whole truth, but enough to make her dangerous if she pushed too far. And she had used it. Whether she meant to or not, she had put his life back into Marcus's hands. But beneath the rage was something worse. Hurt. A deep, hollow ache that came from knowing she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Ethan had trusted so sparingly, allowed so few into fragile perimeter of his life. Clara had been the one exception, the one person he thought he could balance between truth and lies without consequence. Now he realized how foolish that had been. She hadn't betrayed him out of malice. Her face, when he confronted her, proved that. She had tears in her eyes, her hands shaking as she admitted she had only wanted to understand him, to finally break through the wall he always kept between them. But intentions didn't matter anymore. Her actions had lit a beacon in the dark, and Marcus was already moving closer. The confrontation tore Ethan apart. He wanted to scream, to demand why she couldn't have trusted him enough to leave things buried. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain the danger she had just invited into both their lives. But he couldn't. Words caught in his throat, strangled by a fury so intense he could barely see straight. In her eyes he saw regret, fear, love, and guilt tangled into one unbearable storm. In his, she must have seen something else entirely. Something broken, something cold, something that no longer resembled the man she thought she knew. When she reached for him, he stepped back. The silence between them was louder than any shouting could have been. For Clara, it was heartbreak. For Ethan, it was clarity. The walls he had built around his life had been torn down not by Marcus, not by strangers, but by the one person he had let too close. And now the consequences were no longer hers to carry alone. They were his. That night, Ethan's rage transformed into resolve. The betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was fuel, the part of him he had tried to bury, the part that had lived in the shadows, that had fought and survived when others would have fallen, came roaring back to the surface. Clara had handed Marcus the opening he needed, and Ethan understood what it meant. The time for hiding was over. The time for revenge had begun. The city never truly slept. Even in the deepest hours of night, the streets pulsed with rhythm of their own. Flashing lights in the distance, the hum of traffic, the occasional echo of footsteps that weren't always friendly. Ethan knew this rhythm well. For years, he had blended into it, a ghost among the crowd, a man who survived by staying invisible. But now, invisibility was no longer an option. Marcus knew he was alive. His cover had been blown. His carefully built walls had collapsed. And with that collapse came a dangerous clarity. For days, Ethan had paced his apartment, thoughts moving faster than he could contain. Rage simmered beneath the surface, but it was not wild. It was sharp, cold, calculated. He knew better than to let anger control him. Marcus would expect that. Marcus would be watching, waiting for him to make a reckless move. But Ethan wasn't the man he once was. And if he had learned anything in the years of running, it was patience. Revenge, if it was to mean anything, had to be deliberate. He began with surveillance, not of Marcus directly. Marcus was too clever to leave easy tracks, but the people around him, the ones Marcus trusted. Ethan knew from experience that every powerful man had weaknesses, and those weaknesses were rarely in themselves but in the network they relied on. Ethan started with a man who had once been Marcus's right hand, a brute named Kellen Royce. A man too loud, too arrogant, too careless to ever be truly invisible. Ethan followed him for 3 nights, memorizing his routines. The bars he stumbled into, the cards he gambled on, the woman he met in secret when he thought no one was watching. Ethan didn't strike, not yet, but he took notes. Weakness wasn't just about habits. Weakness was about leverage. Next came information. Ethan had contacts, people he hadn't spoken to in years, but who still owed him favors they could never repay. He called them in, one by one, never revealing too much but always asking the right questions. Who was Marcus working with now? What had changed in the years since Ethan disappeared? What were the whispers in the underworld? The deals happening in the shadows? The answers painted a picture of a man more dangerous than ever, but also more reckless. Marcus had expanded his reach, but expansion brought exposure, and exposure meant vulnerability. Through it all, Ethan kept Claire at a distance. The betrayal still burned in his chest, but he didn't hate her. No, what he felt for her was something more complicated, something that clawed at him in the dark hours of the night. He wanted to forgive her, but forgiveness wouldn't undo the damage. And so, for now, she became another part of the silence he carried. He watched her from afar once or twice, ensuring Marcus's men hadn't reached her yet. He told himself it was precaution, but the truth was he couldn't quite let her go. Not yet. By the end of the first week, Ethan had drawn the outlines of a plan. He wouldn't go after Marcus directly. That would be suicide. Instead, he would dismantle Marcus's empire piece by piece, tearing away the layers of protection until Marcus stood exposed, with nowhere left to run. It would take time, precision, and a willingness to become the man Ethan had tried so hard not to be. The man who fought in shadows, who struck without warning, who didn't hesitate when hesitation meant death. He felt the old instincts returning like muscle memory. The way he studied a room for exits before stepping inside. The way his hands moved without thought as he pieced together makeshift tools, weapons hidden in plain sight. The way his breathing slowed when he imagined confrontation. His body already preparing for the violence he knew was coming. It terrified him, how easily it all came back. But it also thrilled him, because it meant he was ready. One night, sitting at the table with a single lamp burning above him, Ethan spread out the notes he had gathered. Faces, names, routines, all of them carefully recorded in his tight, precise handwriting. He stared at them for a long time, then circled the first name. Kellen Royce. Marcus's right hand. The first domino. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't just plotting revenge. He was building a war. And this time, he wasn't the one running. Marcus had taken enough from him. His freedom, his peace, his chance at a normal life. Now, Ethan would take everything from Marcus, piece by piece, until the man who once thought himself untouchable finally understood what it felt like to lose. The hunter had returned. And this time, he wouldn't stop until the game was over. Ethan had circled Kellen Royce's name again and again, each stroke of ink carving a promise into paper. Marcus's empire was strong, but Kellen was the pillar propping up its weight. If Ethan could knock him down, it would send a tremor through the entire structure. He knew the risks. Kellen was dangerous, unpredictable, and loyal to Marcus in a way only men who had nothing else to live for could be. But he also knew something Marcus didn't. Kellen's arrogance made him careless, and carelessness left cracks Ethan could slip through. The night Ethan chose his move, the city was drowned in rain. Sheets of water pounded the sidewalks, lightning splitting the sky in quick, angry flashes. Kellen, true to routine, was at his favorite bar on the edge of town, drowning himself in whiskey and attention from anyone willing to feed his ego. Ethan watched from the shadows outside, hood pulled low, the storm masking his presence. Every instinct in his body hummed with tension. It wasn't fear. It was the raw electricity that came before action, the knowledge that once he stepped out of the shadows, there was no going back. Inside, Kellen laughed too loudly, slapped too many shoulders, told stories of the kind of bravado that only men like him believed. Ethan slipped in unnoticed, blending with the few late-night stragglers. His eyes locked onto Kellen, but he didn't move toward him. Not yet. Instead, he positioned himself at the far end of the bar, listening, waiting, memorizing every word. Kellen's mouth was his weakness. He bragged about money, about women, about power he barely understood. And buried in his boast was information, hints of Marcus's operations, shipments moving through docks, names of men on payroll. Every word was a weapon, and Ethan collected them silently. But gathering intel wasn't enough. Tonight wasn't just about listening. Tonight was about making the first strike, the kind that would send Marcus a message without revealing too much. Ethan waited until Kellen staggered toward the back, alone, heading for the restroom. The storm outside raged harder, thunder shaking the building as Ethan followed, his footsteps silent against the sticky floor. The hallway was dim, the kind of place no one paid attention to, and when Kellen pushed the door open, Ethan slipped inside behind him. The confrontation was quick. Ethan locked the door with a steady hand, and when Kellen turned, confusion flashed into recognition. "You!" Kellen began, but the word never finished. Ethan was on him in a heartbeat, one hand pressed against his chest, slamming him into the tiled wall. "Quiet!" Ethan hissed, his voice low, lethal. "Make a sound, and you won't leave this room." Kellen's bravado faltered, fear creeping into his bloodshot eyes. "You're supposed to be dead," he muttered, his voice trembling. Ethan's grip tightened. "You talk too much. That's going to be the end of you." He didn't kill him. Not yet. Death would be too quick, too clean. Instead, Ethan forced Kellen to talk. The threats came sharp. The promises of what happened if he didn't cooperate, clear enough to make even a man like Kellen sweat. Piece by piece, Kellen gave him what he needed. routes Marcus used, safe houses, names of trusted men. Ethan absorbed it all, storing it like ammunition. And when he was done, he leaned in close, his voice a whisper that cut deeper than any blade. "Tell Marcus I'm coming. Tell him he should have stayed in the shadows, because now I'm pulling him into the light." Then with a swift strike, Ethan left Kellen unconscious on the floor, bruised but breathing. It wasn't mercy, it was strategy. By letting him live, Ethan ensured the message would reach Marcus exactly as intended. As Ethan stepped back into the storm, rain washing over him, a strange calm settled in his chest. For years, he had been running, hiding, bearing the part of himself that once thrived in chaos. But tonight, that part had returned. The hunter was alive again, and his prey was already trembling. Far across the city, Marcus would soon hear the news. His loyal man humiliated, his secrets compromised, his illusion of control shaken. It wouldn't destroy him, not yet, but would rattle him, and rattled men made mistakes. Mistakes Ethan was ready to exploit. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like prey. He felt like the storm itself, and Marcus Hale was standing in its path. Marcus Hale had always carried himself like a king. Even in the underworld, where loyalty was bought and life was cheap, Marcus exuded power. He sat in high places, surrounded by men who would kill at his command, shielded by wealth, weapons, and fear. For years, Ethan had disappeared from that world, carving out a life in anonymity. But anonymity was gone now, ripped away by betrayal and Marcus's relentless shadow. And so Ethan stood at the edge of the city's abandoned docks, the rain pouring down like it had the night of his first strike, waiting for the moment he had been planning since the day Marcus resurfaced. The air was thick with salt and rust, the smell of damp wood and gasoline clinging to every breath. Ethan's eyes swept the area. Marcus's men were here, hidden but not invisible. He could feel them in the dark, restless, weapons in hand. Marcus never came without protection. But Ethan hadn't come unprepared. Every step of this night had been calculated. Every move had been rehearsed in his mind until it was instinct. He hadn't chosen this place by accident. The docks were Marcus's pride, the artery of his operations, the ground he thought he controlled. By the time the night ended, that ground would be soaked in more than rain. When Marcus finally appeared, stepping out of a black car with the same arrogance Ethan remembered, time seemed to pause. The years hadn't dulled him. His face was older, sharper, but his eyes still gleamed with that same ruthless fire. He smiled when he saw Ethan, like the sight of him was a prize he had been hunting for too long. "Well," Marcus called out, his voice carrying easily over the storm. "The ghost returns. I almost thought you were smart enough to stay buried." Ethan didn't move. His jaw clenched, his silence heavier than any words. Marcus stepped closer, his men fanning out behind him. "I should thank you, really. I spent years searching, chasing shadows, wondering if you were still alive. And here you are, walking back into my world. You could have had peace, Ethan, but you just couldn't resist, could you?" The laugh that followed was hollow, the sound of a predator savoring the moment before the kill. Ethan's voice, when it came, was steady, cold, deliberate. Peace was never an option with you alive. That was the signal. Lightning flashed, and the docks erupted into chaos. Ethan's traps, planted hours before, came alive. Explosives detonated in precise bursts, cutting off escape routes, scattering Marcus's men into confusion. Gunfire cracked through the storm, shouts filling the air as bodies scrambled for cover. Ethan moved like a shadow among them, striking fast, disarming, incapacitating, never lingering long enough to be pinned. Years of restraint had dulled nothing. His body remembered every motion, every instinct honed in blood and survival. Marcus's empire, his illusion of invincibility, crumbled in minutes. One by one, his men fell, their loyalty useless against a ghost who had returned with vengeance in his veins. And through it all, Marcus watched, fury replacing arrogance as he realized this wasn't just a fight. It was a dismantling, a deliberate destruction of everything he had built. Finally, it came down to the two of them. Amidst the wreckage of flames and shattered crates, Marcus stood with a pistol in his hand, his face twisted in rage. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice shaking. "You've just made yourself the same as me. You're no better." Ethan's eyes burned with something deeper than hate. "The difference," he said, stepping closer despite the gun aimed at his chest, "is that I didn't start this, but I will end it." Marcus pulled the trigger, but Ethan was faster. The struggle was brutal, raw, years of history crashing together in every blow. Marcus fought like a man desperate to cling to his throne, but desperation left him sloppy. Ethan fought with precision, each strike fueled not just by rage, but by the cold resolve of a man who had been running too long. When it was over, Marcus lay on the ground, gasping, broken. The pistol was gone, kicked into the dark waters of the dock. Rain pounded down on them, mixing with blood and dirt, washing away the last illusion of power Marcus had left. Ethan stood above him, chest heaving, every muscle screaming for release. He could end it here, take Marcus's life with a single motion, and no one would fault him for it. But as he looked down at the man who had haunted him for years, who had destroyed his peace and dragged him back into the shadows, Ethan realized that Marcus's death wasn't a true victory. No, Marcus's defeat was. Because tonight, Marcus had lost everything. His empire burned, his men scattered, his control shattered, and the one man he thought was gone forever now stood alive, unbroken and free. Ethan turned, leaving Marcus to choke on the ruins of his own empire. The rain swallowed the sound behind him as he disappeared into the storm, no longer a ghost running from his past, but a man who had faced it and survived.